Okay.
Okay, Mike, I'm recording.
So today is December 26th, 2019, and I'm Mike Murphy. Pat Murphy is on the camera, and this is Neva Murphy. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about William Reddy and the history of the National Company. Uh, During the time that William Reddy was working at the National Company, eventually, my mother was born, and during its sort of heyday during World War II, my mother was a teenager living with her grandparents, parents, and aunt and uncle at the time. So we're just going to go through any remembrances that you have of your grandfather, William Reddy, and then the National Company and what it was like to be a teenager during World War II. Sound good, Mom? All
Yes.
right, so we're going to start with what do you know about your grandfather's family? Obviously, he grew up in Nashville. Do you remember anything about how the family came to settle in Nashville, Tennessee?
I really am not sure about that.
Yeah.
I met his father. I just remember this elderly gentleman coming to visit us on some occasions, and I don't remember when he passed, but I
Did he come
really,
to visit before World War II, or
yes, I think maybe so,
yeah?
because I'm not sure when he passed away. Um, there wasn't that much information about his family, um, and I'm not sure if he had siblings. I don't think so. I don't remember.
And did he talk about his dad or his family at all?
Not that much. That's what makes me think that there wasn't, his family wasn't quite as extensive.
Hmm.
Um, I knew more about my grandmother's family.
And was she from Nashville as well, or
Yes,
and so they met in Nashville?
they met in Nashville, and he was he was about 3 or 4 years older than she was,
Hmm.
but he certainly fell in love with her.
And did they get married before they came to MIT?
Yes, they did. Well, no, he came to MIT and spent his first year up there, and he missed her so much that after that summer or so, he went back down and married her. She was 17 years old,
Wow.
but he missed her so much that he married her and brought her back up, and I venture to say perhaps they were among the very first of married students, and they had an apartment off campus but close by, and it was a place for, they always invited their friends, his friends, student friends, to come over to the apartment, and they loved coming over there. Um, I was thinking he was the class of 1913.
Hmm.
You probably have that
Yeah.
information, but it was a place that people enjoyed gathering, apparently, and it was fun for them to have them come over. It was a place that they could have to go that was a little bit set aside from classrooms and
Hmm.
that kind of thing.
And do you remember, did he go to MIT for his undergraduate degree?
Yes.
So he was elected the president of the class of 1913,
Hmm.
the undergraduate class of 1913.
And then he was the permanent president of the class, all as an alum.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, we have some great pictures of reunions,
yes.
including one from 1938 we'll take a look at afterwards. And so he graduated from MIT in 1913 as sort of a young married couple. Do you, what memories do you have of what they did after MIT?
Um, I'm not too sure. He went to work. The company was formed, I think, wasn't it 1916?
So it was around that time. It was a previous toy company um, during that time period.
Oh,
And we've got
yes.
some history of sort of when he joined. So when was your mother born and when was Lena born?
Ooh, let's see.
And so how many children did they have, and
They had
when were the kids born?
3 children. Mother, my mother, the first Neva,
Yeah.
and Lena, and then Bill was born.
So Neva, our grandmother Mimi, was born first. Do you remember what year she was born?
I'm sorry you asked. I'm not sure. Um, and I know that both Mother and Lena had been born when they went to Cuba.
So they were both born in Cuba?
No, I think they they went over on a boat,
Hmm.
and the 2 girls. I don't remember if Bill was born afterwards. I have the feeling he was.
How much younger was Bill than Lena?
Well, probably only 3 years.
Yeah.
They were they were fairly close together.
And what were they doing in Cuba?
Oh, he went to work for the United Fruit Company.
Okay.
Doing
So
what?
like,
I'm not sure.
was that a banana company, sugarcane?
Yeah,
And he was some kind of engineer for them?
I guess so. I'm not too sure, but I assume that. I'm sorry that I can't
No, no.
say for sure.
Any idea how many years were they there? A couple years?
I think so. Something. It wasn't that long. 2, 3 at the most.
Yeah. And and so when were you born? So when did your parents get married?
Actually, 1928. 28, and I was born in 29.
Hmm. And how did your parents meet?
Oh, they met in grade school, the Runkle School in Brookline, and it grew from there. And then,
So Grandpa grew up in Brookline as well?
yes, I'm not sure where his father, my grandmother, my father's mother passed away just before I was born, so I never knew her. And then he had, by the time I was old enough to go and visit with them, he had remarried. And they lived in Brookline, down
Mhm.
near Coolidge Corner.
Yeah. And the Bain side of the family came from Scotland, from what we've
Yes,
sort of been able to document.
that's it, yeah.
And are the Reddys Irish or English?
I think they were more English. Um, Pops it's my grandmother's family that as I said, got to know more about, because she was part of a good sized family.
Yeah. Do you remember her maiden name?
Was Haynes,
Haynes.
Neva Haynes Reddy, that's who she was. And she had older brother, mostly, she was the younger one. She had older brothers and sisters who I believe helped raise her.
Hmm.
And
And was she the original Neva?
yes,
So there's no Neva before her. She was the original Neva.
she's the original.
Wow.
And it was always the first girl born in each generation up until now. But we do have the fifth in my brother's granddaughter.
Yeah. So your parents were they were married in 1928, and they were pretty young, right?
17 and 18.
Wow.
They eloped.
Before they graduated from high school, or?
I think maybe so. I mean, maybe my father might have graduated. But
So they eloped, like they went to a church somewhere on their own?
I guess.
Yeah.
I was legitimate, I was told.
And so you were born in 1929,
Mm-hmm.
basically right around the time of the stock market crash and beginning of the Great Depression. Where did you guys live, from
We
what you
lived,
remember?
Mother and Dad had a little apartment on Commonwealth Avenue.
In Boston?
No, out in on the way to Boston College almost.
Okay.
They had an apartment there, and my grandfather had built just before that, he had had a good part in the construction of this. How it had steel girders. It was an English brick house he built in Brookline on the end of Clinton Road, and it had 7 bedrooms. And at that point, my aunt and uncle were just about going off to colleges, and so there were empty bedrooms.
And so that's Lena and Bill?
Bill. Um, they were still there. Lena was finishing. Oh, she went to Notre Dame Academy, as my mother did too, and she just about finished that.
Is that in Hingham? That's the Notre Dame Academy that's still around today?
It is. It's down in the Hingham area.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
right. I didn't realize they went there.
But mother, of course, was busy raising a child, and so my grandfather said the house was gradually emptying when my aunt and uncle went off to colleges, and he said, "Why do you have an apartment over here? We've got these empty bedrooms." And I think they were kind of intrigued with having a little girl around, knowing him, and and my grandmother too, they were like my second set of parents. So, which really worked out quite well. Occasionally they disagreed with my parents on what I should be doing, but we gradually worked it out.
How old were you, do you think, when you moved in with your grandparents in Brookline? Like 5, 10?
Oh no, I think 29. I was probably 3 or 4 years old.
Oh, wow. So right during the Depression.
Oh yeah.
Do you have any, I mean, obviously you were very, very young. Do you have any memories of the Depression?
I don't really, because my family weren't the ones they hadn't all built up big funds and lost money. They were just getting started.
Yeah.
And so it didn't have that much effect. And he was doing very well, obviously, if he built this big brick house.
Yeah. And so he was working for the national company at this point.
I'm not sure about that. I guess he was. I always remember he was with the national company, but I'm not sure about the dates. I don't remember any of the other part. I was just told about the Cuba thing, and that's the only thing I knew of his working for some other place.
Yeah. And what are your memories of growing up as a young child of your grandparents? What was it like growing up with your grandparents in Brookline, if you remember?
Oh, I remember a lot. I told you a little bit about it, but they were always interested in what I was doing and how I was doing. And I had the feeling I never wanted to do anything to displease them, because I knew I was so fortunate to be living there, because my parents had only been married a few years.
Mm-hmm.
I would never have had some of the privileges that I had.
And would you guys have dinner together
Yes, we
every
did.
night?
My grandmother was then, and all through her life, she loved having family around. It became a little bit hard when my uncle Charlie was married to Lena, and she wanted to have everybody come for Sunday dinner, and sometimes it cut short his game of golf on Sunday mornings. But she was great. Her big interest was people getting together and getting to know each other and enjoy each other.
And who would do the cooking?
At that point, sometimes we had some help.
Mm-hmm.
Usually some Irish girls that they heard about or something that were over and needed work.
And so how many people would be at dinner?
Oh, it would range. It could be 10 people. It would range. I mean, at night, we just had, there were 6 of us, or
Mm-hmm.
7, because I was an only child for 10 years. So I was but I was included with the adults.
So you basically grew up in a very sort of adult environment.
Yes, and I do remember during World War II, Pops often invited some of the, when they were doing work for the Bureau of Ships, which that was a big concentration of their business in that war.
In
And he
with the
often would
Navy.
invite the commanders of the ships for dinner.
Hmm. So we've got a picture that on the back of it they note Admiral Dan Shea as one of the guys who was a sort of a guest of honor at one of the National Company gatherings
Yeah,
with
I
hundreds
remember
of
that
people.
name. I can't remember the name that really got me was, I think it was some commanders on a submarine, and one of the men's name was Ringling,
Hmm.
and he was part of the
Oh
Ringling
wow!
Circus family.
Wow.
And I just you can imagine
Yeah.
what fun that was for me to meet somebody like that.
Um, and so let's talk about your family. So you were born in 1929,
Hmm.
and you said you were an only child until you were 10.
So your Aunt Jackie came along.
Okay, so then was that Aunt Jackie was born in 1939 or
Yes.
so? Um, and where were you guys living at that time?
We were still living in Brookline.
In Brookline? Again, at that same. Do you remember the street it was on?
Oh yes, Clinton Road. Because I had two other friends on Clinton Road, and I was the furthest away, so we would all three walk together and walk to the Runkle School, which was the same school my mother and dad went to.
Any idea what number on that road? Is the house still there?
Yes, I've taken some of your your siblings there,
Huh.
drove them by.
Yeah. And
It's 416 Clinton Road. It's at the end of Clinton Road, and it was kind of in the center of where two or three streets came together, and it sat up on a hill.
Yeah.
And it was a neat house, and had a wonderful backyard with a great big elm tree in the middle of it. And there was a little girl who lived next door, and another friend who lived down the street a ways that I played with a lot. So we often would play in the backyard,
Hmm.
or else in the driveway, hitting some balls or something.
Yeah. And so then Pops would drive from Brookline to Malden,
Yes,
where
he
the
did.
National Company was.
He did every day.
What kind of car? Do you remember what kind of car he had?
One
This would have
time
been back in the 30s and 40s.
he had a Lincoln Zephyr at one point, and they often had Buicks. I don't know if they were big on that,
Hmm.
but I don't. It was the neat house, and it was a double garage underneath the house. Instead of two cars parked next to each other, one was ahead of the other
Oh, wow.
one, and that made it a little tricky
Yeah.
with moving cars around.
And so was your mom taking care of you and obviously Jackie when she came? And what was what was Grampy doing during this time?
Grampy worked for Jordan Marsh Company in the men's department
Yeah. And where did he work? Like
in
where?
Boston,
In Boston.
and later, well, the most I remember when I was younger, he was at Jordan Marsh in Boston,
Hmm.
and he loved it, and that's what he did the rest of his life, our life.
Hmm. And he had gone. So he met Mimi when they were in 6th grade, but he'd spent a year or more up at Hebron Academy.
He did.
Longer than a year, or just a year?
I had the feeling it was a little longer, but I can't say for sure.
And he was a 3-sport
But he
athlete
loved
up
it
there.
there.
So we got
Yes.
pictures of him playing goalie in hockey,
Yes.
and he was a really good baseball player. Did he play football as well in the
I
fall?
don't think football. I think it was mainly baseball and hockey.
And so they got married. Basically, he was getting out of Hebron, and they ended up getting married. And then you said he played some semi-pro baseball in Boston as well, right?
There was a field at Cleveland Circle in Brookline
Mm-hmm.
where the road started going up the hill through 30, started going up the hill. There was a field there, and he would play when I was a child, we'd go down and watch.
You remember him playing?
I remember seeing him play.
Wow.
It was a semi-pro ball team.
Hmm.
And he was good enough that he could have, but they were starting a family, and at that time, baseball didn't pay much of anything.
I'm sure.
Very different. I do remember that. That's why he chose not to become a professional baseball player.
Yeah. What? So when and why did you guys move from Brookline to Weston?
I don't know, it was, they would take Sunday drives out, mainly out Route 30, west to Boston. And my grandmother would say, "Oh, Al, isn't the air fresher out here?" And it was very much a country town.
Was he referred to as Al?
Yes.
So
that was
his given name was William.
yes, but his middle name was Aloysius.
Wow.
And then when he said he was confirmed, he became William Aloysius James Mary Reddy. He took the names of parents, I guess it might have been. He'd give his full name to family just for fun.
And so did everybody call him Al?
Well, my grandmother was the one that started that. And yeah, it was Al and Neva.
And so people would come over the house and they would refer to him as Al?
Yep.
Okay.
The MIT people were the ones that knew him as Bill Reddy.
And how was he known at the national company? And they listed as William Reddy because that was his legal name.
Yeah, I think he was called Mr. Reddy.
Okay.
I don't know. You know, we were called that when you were an officer in a company kind of thing, but I can't remember. I don't know about the people that worked there that calling him.
Do you remember what year you guys moved to Weston?
Yes, it was 1944.
Oh, wow.
Because I graduated from Runkle in 43.
And Runkle is a...
Grade school. From the kindergarten, I went all 9 years because it included kindergarten through the 8th grade.
Okay. And then you ended up at going to Dana Hall?
Yes. I think there was another friend who lived in between. Was the next one on the way to Runkle. She lived part way down to the school. And my friend Bubbles was the third one. She was the closest, so the three of us would go. And we had some of the same teachers initially. I did anyway. Some of the same teachers that Mother and Dad had.
Because it was only 20 years later.
Yeah. Yes, that's right.
So during World War II, you lived most of the time of the war in Brookline then, if you didn't move to Weston until 44.
44.
So what memories do you have of World War II? Like, do you remember Pearl Harbor?
Yes, I do. I was mostly spent listening to the radio in sort of disbelief in what had happened there.
And so how old would you have been in 1941?
I was trying to think.
So if it was 29.
I was like 12.
And do you remember any of the lead up to the war, or any sense of things that were happening in Europe?
Yes, I was going to say, because some of it had started over there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a little vague. I have to really think
So
back.
like German invading Poland and Austria, yes. And then eventually France and Belgium.
And then they started a draft, and I remember the boy next door was drafted.
Before Pearl Harbor or after?
It was after.
Yeah. He
was older. He was a teenager when I was at grade school. And
were people volunteering
some
before?
People did, but the draft was a big thing.
Yeah. And how old was Charlie, so your uncle who married Lena, how old was Charlie Hornbostel at the outbreak of the war?
I'm trying to think.
And they were married by that point, right?
Oh, yeah.
And Lena had been born, and Lena was
Yeah, and
older.
they both worked for, what would you call them, financial companies in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
But Charlie was very well known for his athletic.
Sure, because he had run in the 32 and 36 Olympics
Yes, and he'd
with Jesse
also
Owens.
run in a lot more other things, other meets.
Yeah.
Um,
I remember all the amazing silver trophies in their house in
yes,
Wilton when I
yeah,
was a kid.
he had quite a raft of them, and actually he didn't win in the Olympics.
How did he and Lena meet?
I think it was through Wellesley College, a friend at Wellesley or something.
So it was after he graduated from Indiana, and he
Yes,
sort of found his way to Boston.
yes, and I was trying to think if he went to a graduate school.
Well, I think he went to Harvard Business School during the war, didn't he?
I guess so. Yeah, and that may be how they met. It probably is.
And so during World War II, he was, I don't know if he was within the military and they sent him to HBS or just.
He was very upset. They were stationed and went to Washington, and he worked for the government there, and they needed his expertise in numbers and finance, and he wanted to go to volunteer to go, and they wouldn't let him. They were in Washington all during the war.
Hmm. And
That's
so, but he did eventually graduate from Harvard Business School at some point, right?
Yes, I guess he did. He did, and I don't remember what year that was when
Yeah.
it was, but it was during the war, and I just remember that he was very unhappy that
He couldn't be allowed to volunteer and go fight.
friends, people they knew, were shipped over there, and he wanted to be a part of it.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of whatever your earliest memories of the National Company were. So what was your earliest sense that your grandfather worked at a company called the National Company?
Gosh, let's see. I remember being taken over in the car one time. I don't know whether his car was being fixed and Mom drove him over, or Mother did, or something. That would have been rare, but it could have happened. Or else, I do remember going.
And this
And
would have been in Malden.
In Malden. And 61 Sherman Street.
Yep.
Isn't that the address?
What do you remember of the building, if anything? Did you go inside or you were outside?
I just saw their offices. I don't remember that much about seeing them. I might have seen, I've been out on the floor where the production was going on, but I don't remember too much about that. I wasn't taken over that often.
Yeah, and that would have been before you were 10 years old or older than 10?
Yeah.
So you knew you worked at this building, somewhere in Malden.
Yeah, and it was not too bad a drive, but it was a different route commute than going into Boston every day.
Well, you kind of had to fight your way through Boston to get from Brookline to.
He had ways around. I
Going
think,
around.
because I do remember that.
And as you got older, what memories do you have of the National Company?
Well, I just remember, as you point out, some of the things that happened later on.
So people would come to the house, like admirals or people.
And also, they had representatives that were in different parts of the country. That's what I remember too. Some of the names kind of escape me right now, but they had, I'd say, at least 3 or 4, or maybe even 5 representatives who were sales people and represented them and sent in business from wherever their location was, as reps do. And he would have them, they always came for dinner. I just remember the dinner table was where I met most of the people associated with the National Company.
And would they talk about the company at all, or it was just they were there
It was
socially?
both. It was it was my grandmother being very sociable, and she enjoyed meeting all these people too. And you think she was only 17 years old when she started,
Yeah.
and not long after that she was entertaining people, but she knew how to do it. And I don't know.
Well, she's from the South.
I don't know where she was taught, but everybody always came and enjoyed themselves.
And do you remember any of the sort of conversations? Did any of the conversations at those dinners strike you at all?
Oh, they may have, but I was just, I was a little girl, and it
Yeah,
was amazing that I was
it was there.
included in these things. I just sort of listened,
Yeah.
and they'd ask me questions, and I'd answer them. But
Were some of these people in uniform, military uniform?
yes, they were. That's that was definite, and those people.
And these are some pretty senior people, I would imagine.
Well, yeah, I guess they were. As I say, most of them were Navy people.
Yeah. So a lot of their business was done with the Navy early on.
Well, in the beginning, it was, I think that's when I first started seeing the representatives that would come back when they come through to the company and have meetings. He'd have them come out for dinner.
And do you remember any of the other officers of the company coming out for dinner? Any of the other owners of the company?
I do a little bit, but I'm not sure.
Does the name Hopkins mean anything to you?
Warren Hopkins,
And so who is he? What do you remember of him?
and was there a name, Walter Balke?
Mm-hmm.
Those two are probably the first ones I remember, and I don't remember that much about them. I just remember those two names.
Mm-hmm. And so, so, I mean, clearly you had a sense that your grandfather was doing well, doing something.
Mhm.
You started to get an indication, okay, he's working at this thing called the National Company. And then during World War II, when you were, a young, 12 or a young teenager, different military and other reps were coming over for dinner. So you're starting to get a sense that, your grandfather's doing well. This company seems to be doing well. What did you have a sense of what they were doing for the war effort? Did you have a sense of what their purpose was for the war effort during World War II?
Well, to supply these ships with good equipment. And it was very important.
And did your grandfather talk about World War II and his views on the war, or his views of the company's role
Well,
in the war?
he just wanted to make sure that they got those orders out, and because he knew they needed these radios.
Mm-hmm. Did
I
you ever go? Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I probably wouldn't have known anything about shortwave radios
Yeah.
if I hadn't lived in the house and heard a little discussion here and there. But it wasn't our constant topic of conversation.
During the war, did you go out very often to Malden or Melrose,
No,
or ever?
no, it didn't. Because that was it took a while to get over there.
Yeah.
I just admired him every day taking that ride at that point.
Do you remember like when he would get up and leave in the morning, or when he would come back? Would he be back for dinner every night?
Well, for the most part, he was. Because it ran pretty well. And when we didn't have help in the kitchen, Mother and Mom did the cooking.
And what was your sense? And we talked a little bit about this when you came to class a few years ago, and I can't remember if I asked it or a student asked it. But during World War II, there was rationing of food and fuel and just about everything to try to prioritize things for the war effort.
Yes, and there were different classifications. Like if you were engaged in war-related production, you had priorities. You were, I don't know, you were in class A or something.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I can't remember, but we had different letters.
Yeah.
And Pops had something because of the company
Mm-hmm.
and it being involved in war production. But the rationing was something we all learned to live with
Mm-hmm.
because you knew it was necessary. I'd sort of forgotten about that, but it was.
Yeah.
But you just learn to make do with what's available, and you can't do everything you want to do when you want to do it either.
Yeah.
There were certain disciplines that we all had to live with.
Yeah. But obviously, part of the research we've done in the company is pulling all the financial reports of the company. When it went public, it reported its financial results all the way back through before the war. And clearly there was a very big ramp up, obviously, for the need for the demand for these radios, both for the U.S. military and allies as well. And so the company grew and did well. And again, we were fighting the war, with a capitalist system. And so there were some restrictions in terms of pay for employees, and I'm sure there was some caps on the profits that companies could make, but we were taking advantage of the fact that we had private companies with profit incentives putting out these ships, putting out these radios, putting out these planes and submarines and everything else. So the company was doing well during this time period because of the growth to meet the demand during the war, and your grandfather was one of the owners, one of the shareholders. It looks like he bought out Hopkins shares, from what we can understand, when Hopkins died. And so financially he was doing well as well. Did you have a sense of that during this time when people living sort of in rations, and did you have any sense of guilt about living in an ice house during World War II? Or
Well, he already built it, and I think that's when I was sent off to Dana Hall, because he had a feeling if he could afford to do that, I should go because one of my friends was going there.
Okay.
And get a better education.
Yeah.
So I'm very indebted. And I just, as you mentioned something, my father during the war worked at the Four River Shipyard.
Oh, really?
Yes, he did.
Like building ships? Building ships?
He was a marker. He would mark where they were to weld on the ships.
I didn't know that.
Every day, and I think somebody else had a car, and so they went together, because that was a distance down in Quincy.
Oh, he was in the Quincy shipyards. Wow. And that was his job throughout the war?
That's he left Jordan Marsh to do that.
And did he ever talk about that job at all?
Oh, yes, he did a little bit. But I do remember that he was a welder. And isn't it interesting, because later he went back into the clothing business, and one reason men used to like to buy suits from him because he was very good at marking where the alterations should be. And I didn't think about that likeness similarity until now.
And so how old would Grampy have been during World War II? So he had you when he was basically 18 or 19 in 1929. 1939 he would have been 29. So let's call it 31 when the war broke out.
Yeah. Well, he that's why he went in a defense job, because he would have been drafted if he hadn't, and that was one way of being able to stay in the area.
Yeah.
But that's what he did for quite some time.
Interesting. And so you talked a little bit about Pearl Harbor and listening to the radio. What other memories do you have of events during World War II?
Well, it was, let's see, it was D-Day.
Okay. So 44.
Yeah.
And did you know anybody? So you said the boy next door was drafted, and did he go off and fight in the war?
Yes, he did. He was in the invasion of Europe. We found out later. You didn't know where they were. You only knew they were in the Atlantic
Or the Pacific?
area or Pacific. When they went overseas, they had an APO or something. There was another designation for the Pacific. And you were not emailing back and forth. You only knew I have a letter from my uncle, I think, somewhere that I kept. Because we just knew he was in the Pacific, and turned out
So,
he was,
and this is Bill?
yes, he was in New Guinea.
And was he in the Navy or
He was in the Army.
in,
He,
in a combat in a combat
I
unit?
don't know that he saw that much. Um, he had gone to when he went to MIT too, and when he was there, took the ROTC program.
Huh.
And so but we didn't know until he came home where he'd been. And you just got letters, and that was the only way you communicated. So it was quite a different experience than what it is today. And I don't know whether we were better off not knowing.
Yeah.
And then, of course, sometimes people would get these telegrams, and that's how you found out if someone had been injured or killed.
Did you know anybody in Brookline who was killed in action?
I was just trying to think when that subject came up. I don't recall. Just trying to think if I heard of someone that I knew, or even relatives of my friends, because we all talked.
So both the boy next door and your uncle lived through the war.
Mm-hmm. They were among the fortunate ones. I was trying to think of a friend or someone I might have known who was killed in the war, or a relative, and I don't recall that right now. So it was an interesting group of teenage years.
Yeah. Your grandparents must have been very concerned about Bill being abroad.
Oh yeah, we all were, because you didn't know, and the way you found out was there was a Western Union guy appeared at your door in their little uniforms. You didn't get a phone call, but you just knew that something had happened to somebody if one of those guys showed up. So you can imagine being a teenager with everything else you're learning and going through at that time. And then you have all this going on too. It was pretty full.
So in 1944, when you guys moved to Weston, you would have been 15 years old, right? Around 15?
Mm-hmm.
And you'd already started at Dana Hall before?
Mm-hmm.
And so you were driving out from Brookline out to Wellesley?
No, Peg, the other gal that went to Dana as well, our other good buddy, we went by train.
Oh, wow.
There was the Reservoir train stop, just this side of Cleveland Circle.
And it would dump out
And
in Wellesley?
that went out to a central location. I tried to think of it. It's where you met the other train line we met the other train line that would take us to Wellesley. We had to change trains. And I cannot think of what that station was. Because sometimes, if the train wasn't there, we'd have to sit outside the station, because in the early morning it wasn't open, and that was kind of interesting. But we made it, and then we come home on the train too, because the Wellesley train station was just off the square, and Dana was just down the street.
Yeah, right down the road. Interesting. And so you moved out in '44 to Weston, and what was your memory of the Weston house? Like,
It was.
Like, do you remember seeing it for the first time? And
Yes, it was amazing. I knew it was. It was the second oldest home site. It couldn't be called the oldest home, because part of it had burned. And after that they added a wing onto it. So, but the main part of the house, it was right on the road, but there was a huge hemlock hedge in front of it. Because the doorway, literally, you walked out a short ways and there was the road. It was a country road.
Yeah.
So it didn't have the glorious entryway. And the oldest house was down at the end of the street.
On
near,
Chestnut Street?
yes, on the end, it really was on Wellesley Street, just down from Regis College.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a beginning area for the town. You have the two houses in such close proximity there. And I just, I just know that I walked in, I had never seen a house that had a huge chimney in the center of the basic original part of the house, and it had three fireplaces in the living room. The larger one that was on the back was an original kitchen, because it even had a place where they baked bread
Mm-hmm.
in the wall,
Yeah.
and that was the biggest part of it, and that looked out through the windows, looked right out on what eventually became a terrace out there with a U-shape. But this three-sided living room was incredible, and smaller fireplaces on each side. And on the front part, if you use the front door, that's where we had three closets. They were coat closets. Because I don't know how it worked before us, but that's the way we used it. And I thought that was the most fascinating thing about that house. Because then when they added on, the dining room was in the wing, and it had an amazing hood of cement over the fireplace. It was something said it was sort of like a Swedish,
Hmm.
and there was a painting on the cement.
Oh, yeah.
But this three-sided, and my grandmother said when the war was over she was going to light all three fireplaces, and she did. It just was a challenge for her. And when Bill came home,
What do you remember from him coming home?
oh, it was, of course he was married, and his wife was a very bright gal, and she was in the radiology section at MIT. She had a job during the war. She didn't handle his being gone all that well.
Was she living with you, or was she living in Boston?
No, she lived with her mother, and she had two sisters. I think they were married during the war. God, they were younger. But I will say it wasn't a good thing for her. And she worried.
Mm-hmm.
And I think overall it took its toll, because I don't think the marriage was ever the same. But
And did they end up living with you as well when he came back from the war, or?
no, I can't remember exactly what happened. I think she might have. Her mother still had the family house in Belmont. That's where she was from, and I think together they all found an apartment or something for them. And then they got a house they did find a house in Wayland.
Mm-hmm.
So they lived there.
And did he work for the National Company?
He did, and I'm not quite sure if he went directly, but eventually he did work for the company. And so did my Uncle Charlie.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about Charlie. When did Charlie start working for the company? So he was down in Washington during the war. Was it after the war that he started working for the company?
I'm trying to think, because he worked that may be when it happened, because they were both officers of the company for one of those pictures. I think I picked them out.
Mm-hmm. That was in I think it was 53.
Okay. Well, I just remember Charlie working for a financial company, and I don't know whether he went back with them at first and then went to the company or not. I'm not sure of the sequence of events there.
So so you guys move out to Weston in 1944. You're 15 years old. The war ends in 45, and you talked about your grandmother lighting all three fires, and then your uncle comes home. The company went public in April. It looked like April of 1946. Do you remember anything about the company going public?
I do, but it was just
Was it an exciting thing? Was it a noteworthy thing?
Well, it was a large transformation. I don't
In
remember
what way?
that much
What
because,
kind of transformation?
well, I mean, in it, I can't remember if some of the family got shares of stock.
I think they did, because in a prospectus, and this goes true to today, they have to list out who the principal shareholders are.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm fairly certain your grandmother was listed as one of the shareholders.
Oh, I imagine so.
And they owned, I can't remember the exact percentage, but they were sort of the principal shareholders. I'm not sure if they had a majority stake in it, but they had a pretty sizable stake in the
I
company.
think they just did so that nothing else, nobody could come in and take over kind of
Mhm.
thing. Although I'm not sure, the name Louis Lerner meant something.
Yeah,
It rang a bell with me, but I
and that came sort of later, sort of in the
did it.
50s. So the company went public in spring of 1946. And what are your memories of the company after World War II? In terms of, obviously it had a huge ramp up during the war to make these
Mm-hmm.
very specialized radios with a very specialized purpose for the military and intelligence services, um, and the Y stations. And did you have a sense that um, of the role of these radios and sort of historically, and the fact that there's 3 of these radios in the Bletchley Park Museum? Um,
In what
So
was?
Bletchley Park in London is where the codebreakers worked. Alan Turing. Um, so the Enigma machine, that was the German encryptor. All that work was done. A lot of that work for the British was done in this place, in the secret place called Bletchley Park. And so these radios were used in what's called Y stations, which would be listening stations all up and down the coast of Great Britain.
Mm.
And I'm sure along the coast of the United States as well. And during the Battle of Britain, also the Battle of the Atlantic, when the German submarines were sinking so much of the merchant marine traffic and other war traffic going back and forth between America and Europe, it was critical for the Allies to keep the flow of men and material going from the industries of the U.S. to Europe, and so it was imperative to try to hunt down these German submarines before they could sink these ships. And so part of the use of the HRO radios in these Y stations up and down the coastline of certainly Great Britain, but also the U.S., was they could do direction finding on these signals. So the radios were very good at tuning in to a particular frequency that a submarine might be using for a short period of time, and the operator could very quickly find that frequency
Mm.
and sort of lock in on it. And then if you have 3 different radios all locked into the same signal at the same time, they would communicate that to a central direction finding facility, and they could basically triangulate exactly where that submarine was,
Mm.
what direction it was going, and how fast, and they could signal that to ships to go after that submarine before it could sink other ships. Um, and so to this day, we just emailed last week the Bletchley Park Museum asking if they had any information about the HROs. And they said, unfortunately, we don't have archives, but we do have 3 HRO radios
Oh.
on display at Bletchley Park today.
Hmm.
And so we're going to do some follow-up work with them in terms of, well, why do you have HRO radios? And they said the other group to follow up with is there's a radio museum that's attached to Bletchley Park, and so we're going to do some follow-up work with them. But historically, that's what the principal, the reason that they're in such high demand is the particular design of the radio allowed it to very quickly and very accurately find wireless signals on different frequencies. And then if you could do that quickly, you could write down messages that were encoded, and those messages would be motorbiked or otherwise transmitted in their sort of raw form to Bletchley Park and then they would, the mathematicians and the code breakers there would take those raw encoded messages and basically decrypt them
Mm-hmm.
using the first computers that they developed to do this at Bletchley Park. But the other thing that they were used for was directional finding, for trying to find where these submarines or other ships were,
Yeah.
and to try to come up with defenses or to steer
Away
uh,
from
fleets away from them, which is sort of the best outcome, because then the German ships wouldn't know that they had been caught. They would just know, hey, we're not seeing anybody.
them.
So anyway, so we've got and are continue to do research on that side of it. So clearly, the company had a huge ramp up in revenues and profits during the war, making these particular type of radios. And then they go public in April of 1946, basically the next year after the war ends.
Yeah.
And so once you're a publicly traded company, you've got shareholders who want to see profits grow. And strategically, it's very difficult coming off a huge high of World War II,
Yes.
making military, very focused military style receivers,
Mm-hmm.
then to turn around and to try to produce something that you could equal, if not beat, the amount of profits you had during the war doing this very specialized activity. And so that was the principal challenge facing your grandfather and Uncle Charlie as senior officers of this company. Is now you're a publicly traded company, you've got expectations for growth and profits, and you were the best military wireless receiver company in the world. Um, is there a big enough consumer market for
Mm-hmm.
wireless receivers that could equal, if not better, the profits they had during the war? And if not, if that's not a big enough market, what markets do you go into? And so there was a push, even before Hopkins died, um, to try to create, and this is before the war, to try to create a consumer product. And so there was a huge falling out with, have you ever heard of a guy named James Millen?
Yes.
So what do you know about James Millen?
I just know that it was it was difficult. I didn't know the exact.
Did you ever meet him?
I think I may have once or twice. I did know that name. It wasn't a pleasant situation.
And how did you know that it wasn't a pleasant situation?
Well, I just, what little bits of conversation I guess I picked up here or there. I didn't know that much about what the differences were.
And did you know what James Millen did at the National Company?
I'm not sure of that.
Yeah, so he was one of the designers of these radios, and he was also sort of the public face of the company, in that he was, in addition to being a good designer, he was also a very smart marketer. And so he was the guy who was writing a lot of the advertisements for the
Oh.
National Company in, I think it's QST magazine, the
Oh,
wireless magazine. And so he was very much, he was a sort of a marketing side of the National Company. And he was also a designer as well. And so he sort of developed a following among wireless operators, both from his designs and also from his marketing campaigns that he would write. And so part of the difficulty is a disagreement about strategy within the company. And this is before your grandfather, before Hopkins died. And so James Millen ended up leaving the company primarily, from what we understand so far, from what we've read, including a history that was done with mostly the input of James Millen, is that he thought it was a terrible strategy to go away from their strength with sort of professional users and sort of high-end users of these wireless radios to try to come up with some consumer level product.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that was a terrible strategy, and so he got into huge arguments with Hopkins and potentially your grandfather as well, and he ended up leaving the company in dispute about this strategy. Obviously, the World War II happened, and so the company had to focus on those high-end sort of military and uses of the HRO sort of made the argument moot for 3 or 4 or 5 years. But again, once the war ended, the question, and Millen is long gone at this point, once the war ended, what do you do with the company? It's going public, and so now you've got external shareholders with expectations for increased profits. And so we've got a lot of neat letters, management letters, that are required in an annual report. Probably 6 or 7 years of letters from your great-grandfather to the shareholders explaining what's going on at the company and what they're trying to do to develop, new markets for the company. So so you remember a little bit about James Millen, and so what's your memory after the war from like 46 to 50?
Well,
You would have graduated from high school and you were gone in college.
No, but I was thinking, there's a point when I moved to a new town, and I wasn't going to the public school, so I was a teenager, and how did I meet people in town that went to Weston High School or whatever? And I think the biggest help was my family met some of the other parents of young people, and among them being the Whitneys, and my friend Marky and her brother Wilmot. And it was the Whitney family that invited me. They were having a dinner party. There was a couple who gave ballroom dancing classes, or sociables, at the club. And all
At
the
Weston
kids,
Golf Club?
yes, but all the kids in town were invited at a certain age to go to these dances. And the Whitneys had a little dinner party before one, and I was invited to that, and that was, maybe a couple months after we moved there. So that was beginning of meeting a lot of my friends who became later my very good friends.
Yeah.
It was marvelous, and I came home and I'd had a wonderful time, because I like to dance, and I took dance lessons. I can't think if I was still doing that for 8 years, but I think when we got out to Weston it was a little harder to get into where I used to take the dance lessons. But anyway.
Yeah. But you would have been 15 or 16 years old, right?
Yeah, so that's a tough age to move to a new town, and so I was concentrating a little more on some of that than I was when I was a youngster. But I still, it amazed me that they included me at the table whenever people came connected with the company. So a lot of those memories are there, but there's a lot that have gone away.
Yep.
Or didn't, or if they were not too pleasant, I guess I kind of left the room or something.
Yeah.
I had enough to think about being a student, and
Yeah. What was going to Dana Hall like?
oh, it was great. It was harder, although I'd done pretty well in grade school. It was a different concentration. It was just all girls school, and it was harder for me, but I got through that, and that's where I met, the second year I was there, I think, that's when I met Annie Bowman, and I made some very good friends there, and sometimes I brought them home. They were from other towns, too, so we'd go to each other's houses, and I played field hockey, and I can't remember what she did. There were other friends, too. And another girl from Weston went over there. She was a year or two behind me, and she had a car. So Mother used to take me over and drive me home. I can't remember when. I did not have a car myself, and I can't remember how I got there. Before the last year I was there, I went with this girl that was a couple of years younger. She had a car, and she would pick me up. And
were most of the girls at Dana Hall at this time going to Dana Hall with the expectation that they were going to go on to college?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was... I don't know that anybody went there that wasn't. It was pretty much college.
And would that be true if you had gone to Weston High School?
Yes, it was pretty. I think most everybody did
Yeah.
go on. In other towns, um, you might have had a larger population, and so it was. There were people that went to a state school or something, but Weston pretty much everybody went on to college.
Yeah. And so this is the age that you were basically Grace and Fiona's age. And so what did you think that you would potentially want to do in college or later on? Like, did you have a sense of
I
what you
didn't know.
wanted to
It
do?
wasn't until senior year in at Dana that I took biology. You had to take a science, and I sort of put it off. And I had a wonderful teacher, and I have to say that she influenced me. I knew I had a pretty good idea that that's what and when I had one elective I could take when I was a freshman in college, so I took a biology course to see what the department was like. So that put me ahead of the game in my list for my major. I had room for a music appreciation, and when I was a senior, I was only sorry that I didn't. There was another.
And were you a good student?
Yeah,
Were you
I
good
was a
at?
good student. I wasn't that excellent. I got probably mostly B's in things. Some things I got A's, but not. I didn't. I wasn't. I can't say I was terrific, but I did get by all right, and I certainly did all right in my jobs, the jobs that I got, and the jobs that I did, and got paid well for them.
And so what was your first job?
First job was at Harvard, in the sanitary engineering department. I never knew Harvard had an engineering school.
And was this after you graduated from college or while you were
Yes,
still in college?
yes. No, this was after I graduated.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to work as an assistant to the professor. In sanitary engineering, they were getting master's degrees, and they took courses in biology, physics, and chemistry, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were students there. They were all men, for the most part, and about 6 or 7 of them were from foreign countries.
Mm-hmm.
As one man said, he'd been building sewers in Mexico for 8 years, and the government finally sent him to Harvard to find out why. So I worked as the lab assistant. I prepared all the lab materials and set it all up for him, and it was Dr. Chang, this Chinese doctor, and he would give her the lab lecture, and I would go around and help him help them.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was my main job. And then one day he said, Neva, I can't be here today. I've been there, I'd done it for a couple of years. And he said, you do the lab lecture, okay? So I said, okay. And so I did it. And I did that for a few times. And then one time I looked up in the lab outside. The lab room was just before the lab itself. I looked out and there was the head of the department. And he was sort of kind of wandered back and forth, and I knew he'd heard that I'd been doing this. And so I guess I passed all right, but I knew exactly why he came. So it was interesting. So I was there for 5 years.
Mm-hmm. In that same lab?
In the same lab. And then I met your father. I met him, and I decided maybe it was time to go down to New York and see what I could find there. And that's when I went to work for Rockefeller Institute. And that was different. It was in research.
So wait, so what was the impetus from the move from, and were you living in Weston during this time you were working at Harvard?
Oh yeah, because my family said, what do you need to spend money on an apartment for? If it looks like you can't get along with your family. If you can't get along with your family, how are you going to get along with anybody else?
Yeah.
It was a different thinking. Girls were just beginning to get apartments, and Annie Bow was in with 2 or 3 others, And finally, when there was a vacancy there, I moved in with them. In New York, I did. She was working in New York too at that time. But it's
And where'd you guys live in New York? So what part of New York City?
right near. I could walk to work. Lived between York and First Avenue. And Rockefeller Institute was across the street on York Avenue.
But Midtown? Because
Hmm?
Bubbles lived, I mean, later on,
She
lived
was
up at 87th.
87th Street. That's right. We were in the 60s. With the girls, um, I was on East 64th Street. And then when Dad and I had gotten married, we got an apartment on East 63rd Street. So when I could walk just across the street and up a little ways. And then I was very near the same corner where Cornell Medical College was.
Yeah.
Cornell Medical, whatever. And then Sloan Kettering was on the other corner. The three places were right close together.
And so what kind of work, what lab, what kind of work were you doing in New York?
It was microbial genetics. The research was a guy named Dr. Norton Zinder.
So some early work in genetics?
Mm-hmm. He was, that's what he was known for.
And what type of research? Was he doing research? What were you doing? Just the same type of idea,
I was
lab?
doing the lab work for him.
And was there any teaching involved, or is it just the
No.
research?
They did start having a few students there then, but it was not primarily known for that. And only later did it become, we had one particular student most of the time I was there, but then the student population grew, and now it was soon called Rockefeller University.
Yeah.
But I wasn't in on that, but I did enjoy.
And what discoveries did you guys have while you were working for the guy?
I can't remember.
Do you remember any like sort of noteworthy things in the lab that you guys were working on? Or?
I haven't thought about that in a long time. I really can't. I just remember the name. I thought the other day coming up with microbial genetics. That's what it was. But I really can't say much about it at this point. My memories are more of the job at Harvard.
Yeah. And so how did you meet Dad?
He roomed at MIT with a guy who married another good friend of mine from college.
And
We
so
were
when
both
did you
in
guys?
their wedding.
Oh, you were in the wedding. Where was the wedding, and when was that?
It was in Baltimore.
What year?
I can't say for sure.
Before 1950?
Let's see, their wedding was before ours, because that's where we met, so, I don't know, it could have been 52 or 3.
Yeah. And what was your impression of Dad?
Well, he was an interesting guy. I had a good time with him, and he was interested in a lot of things that I was. We had things that we enjoyed doing together, and we had good friends, other couples in New York, and and there was so much to do there, too, that we enjoyed doing. And then at one point we finally decided that if we were ever going to have a family at all, we should think about going out and living out of the city. Because I watched young friends with babies and children in the city, and it was not easy. So.
When did you guys get engaged? So you got married in 58, right?
58, yeah. Well, your father used to say we were engaged 5 times. We kept trying, and then to put it together, and it took us a while. So, 58, we got engaged. Yeah, I guess And we got married in August.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was probably around Christmas time or something that year.
Yeah.
You know, when this brain is
Yeah.
full of a lot of stuff. Then some things go away and some things hang on, and then sometimes some of the other things come back. You never know.
You want to take a little break, Mom? Because the kids are at the door. So you want to do like a 5-minute break, and I could sort of get them up, and
Oh,
then we
yeah.
can finish up.
So where are they? Are they downstairs?
Okay, we're recording. Um, so, Mom, we're gonna sort of finish up talking about the national company, and I know during these years, sort of like 48 to 53. Um, Again, you'd graduated from Dana Hall, you'd graduated from Randolph-Macon. We already talked about the 3 or 4 years you worked in the labs at Harvard, and then you moved subsequently down to New York City and worked for Rockefeller University.
It was called Rockefeller Institute then.
Mm-hmm. Doing some sort of early genetics work with a doctor there,
Mm-hmm.
Zindard,
Norton Zender.
um, and that's where you met Dad. And so during these years, you were away from home, and you probably only came back to visit for vacations or holidays. So you may not have as much direct sort of knowledge of
That's
what was
right.
going on at the national company.
That's right.
Um, but let's talk a little bit about what you do remember hearing or seeing if you happen to be there. So again, the company went public in April of 1946, and you said that was sort of a transformative type of experience for the family, some of the other family members, and we saw this on the capitalization table of the IPO. That I definitely remember seeing your grandmother's name listed as one of the principal shareholders, and there might have been some other people there as well. Um, so at some point, Charlie Hornbostel did work directly for the national company. It was sometime during this time period. And so were they living in Weston with your grandparents, or did they have a
No,
separate
that's
place?
when they had their house in Wayland.
Oh, really? I didn't realize they lived in Wayland.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so Charlie ended up becoming an officer of the company, involved in the company. And in fact, in one of the last year, during this sort of shareholder battle with this Lewis Lerner guy, Charlie ends up becoming, I'm pretty sure, the president of the company, or a very senior executive
I
of
was
the
going to
company.
say, I can't remember for sure. I thought maybe he was vice president or something.
Yeah.
But maybe he was. And my uncle was involved in it too.
Yeah. And again, from the annual reports that are in the archives of the Harvard Business School library, I've read them through once. We're going to go back through them again because it's pretty neat. Because it's basically like having a conversation with your grandfather, talking about the company. Because he's talking to the shareholders, trying to explain their strategy each year,
Mm-hmm.
from 1946, from the original IPO, and then the SEC requires him and the company to put out an annual report every year. And as part of that annual report, there's a letter to the shareholders. So it was pretty neat, in the archives of Baker Library at HBS, reading the shareholder letters that I've read a million times for a million different companies, but this time it's my great-grandfather, and he's in this sort of strategic struggle with the company of what do you do with a company that was incredibly successful during World War II, making a very sort of high-end radio with a very particular sort of military purpose. Well, what do you do after the war when there's not nearly as much wartime demand, but you still have a whole lot of technical expertise around certainly wireless receivers and other electronics. What do you do? How do you try to increase your sales and your profits when the military market has basically dried up? And so some of the things that they did, they developed the first atomic clock, which was a unique, sort of a groundbreaking research effort to develop an incredibly accurate clock, which is important from a variety of certainly military perspectives, but from satellites as well, being able to time where a satellite is in time and space, you need an accurate measure of time, and this nuclear clock, the atomic clock that they came up with, enabled incredibly precise and never changing accurate measures of time that had a whole bunch of scientific applications, and that was sort of a groundbreaking thing for the company. But again, you're not going to sell 1 million atomic clocks, so that's not necessary. It's an incredible scientific achievement, but from a business standpoint, you'll sell a bunch of those, but you're not going to sell so many of them that it's going to make the shareholders really happy. So do you remember what some of the products that they worked on during this time period? I know they worked on a TV. They were, the national company actually produced
He did
an early
produce a
television
set.
And did you have one of those
We
at the
did.
house? What's your memory of a national company television?
I just remember that the television was about this big, and the screen was bigger
Small.
than 5x7.
Yeah.
But it was pretty small. And you had, and then there was a magnifying glass that fit over it.
That would make the projection bigger?
Yes.
Oh, wow. And were there any other companies' TVs in your home in Weston
I
besides
don't
the
know, it was
national
like
company?
RCA. I
Yeah.
think they had one. And yes, we eventually, one side of that three-sided living room was the TV section.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't have a den, but that was where we sat at night and would watch the television. And we eventually got a floor television.
Mm-hmm.
The cabinet went to the floor.
Yeah.
So
And did the national company make those TVs for very long, or?
not too long, because they were so good, and it was too expensive. RCA could come out with something, or a big company like that could come out with something that was less expensive to buy.
Yeah, and I think, and I'd need to go back and do some more research on it, but I'm pretty sure it's either RCA or Westinghouse own the patent on the vacuum tubes or the transistors, and so the national company was having to subcontract out with a competitor for the very necessary components of the TV.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, the competitor is only going to allow somebody to compete with them on a limited basis, and if you need that component to make a TV, you're sort of in a strategic, tough position, because you're relying upon your competitor to actually make the TV to compete against your competitor.
Yeah.
And so it seemed like they made a technically very good TV, but strategically from a business standpoint, they couldn't scale up that business because they were dependent upon their competitor to provide them the necessary component to make the TV in and of itself. And so a lot of letters to the shareholders are talking about other consumer products that they're working on that will hopefully ramp up, that will sort of meet the expectations of the shareholders for revenue growth and profit growth. And at some point during this time period, and it sounds like it was like the early 50s, this Lewis Lerner guy comes into the picture. And from what I can tell is he was a very early version of an activist investor, somebody we would call today, basically doing a hostile takeover, which when I first sort of heard about it and then read about it, I couldn't believe that in 1950, 1953, that there were hostile takeovers on Wall Street. What's your memory of Lewis Lerner or the events leading up to your grandfather basically leaving or ending his relationship with the company?
I don't remember too much about that because I don't think I was not living back here at that time.
And did you have many conversations with your grandfather about the company, and when you would come home to visit, or talking to your parents about what's going on with the
You
company?
made more an impression on me now about it was just pretty unhappiness in the family. I mean, as far as
And
he was
talk about
concerned.
your grandfather's relationship to the company and to the employees of the company. What kind of leader was he?
Oh, they loved him. He was a beloved man because he was interested. He'd see them when he go and he walked through the plant a lot, and they said that he would go up to him, so and so, how are you doing? How's your son John? Or wasn't maybe had some problems or something. He asked. He kept up with all of them. He really had a personal relationship with most all the people that worked for him.
Hmm. And we've read that in different. So there's a number of people who are radio enthusiasts, ham radio enthusiasts,
Yes.
and the national company sort of has a cult following of people that are interested in the history of the company, that are interested in the radios and refurbishing the radios and using the radios to this day. And so we've read a number of the histories that different, basically, radio enthusiasts / amateur historians have written about the company. And I'm just trying to find one of the quotes that talked about the relationship your grandfather had with the people working there, because it's basically exactly what you're talking about. It seemed like the same leadership qualities that his classmates at MIT sought to vote him the president of the class sort of held true as a leader of the company as well. And what was his? So you talked a little bit about what were his labor relations, for lack of a better term? Were there workers unhappy at the company, or did he have generally a good relationship with them as a labor force?
Well, I think from what I knew of it, he had a pretty good relationship with them. I mean, it may have changed when he got so involved with trying to find a different market, but
And we've got pictures of, during the war they would have these victory dinners.
yes.
And right after the war in 1946, there was a big, huge party at the Boston Copley Hotel, where it was called the National Company Get Together, where it seemed like they were doing a lot of things to for employee morale, or to show appreciation for the employees. So is it fair to say that the National Company was sort of his baby, his?
It was.
It wasn't just some sort of financial interest that he had in the company.
Oh no, he was very devoted to it and to the workers. That was just his way.
And so, Louis Lerner, as an activist investor, has a very different perspective. He sees a company as sort of a financial instrument to try to earn money, which again, that's part of capitalism too, is investing in companies and looking for a financial return. But he wasn't necessarily as interested in sort of employee relations. He was much more focused on, as most investors are, on the financial results and growth of profits in the company. And maybe not necessarily longer term, but maybe they're interested in making that profit and sort of getting out. Your grandfather had worked at the company for decades, and had a pretty close personal relationship with most of the employees at the company, and had a pretty long-term interest in the company. And it seemed like these two different forces sort of clashed.
They really did.
In the early 50s. And so, like an activist investor, you start taking a position in a company, buying shares in the company,
And building them up.
and building them up.
He did it quietly.
And so there are slightly different rules today, that once you reach 5% of the shares, you have to publicly declare who you are. And I don't know, I'd have to go back and check to see if those rules were in effect in the 1950s. My guess is that they weren't. And so that he could have gone beyond 5% of the shares and quietly built them up to something higher. That's something we're going to have to sort of check the rules.
I just, I was not involved that much, but I did know something about that when they said about the proxies and things, some of the stuff that he did. I just knew it wasn't pleasant.
So whenever part of the proxy vote is who controls the board, and so there'll be a vote that if you have a certain percentage of the shares, you can try to push for a certain question to be put towards the shareholders. And by SEC law, you have to write the shareholders and tell them, hey, here's this question that we are asking you to vote on, and there'll be a meeting to do these votes, or you can just merely check yes or no on this proxy and mail it back in. So you don't physically have to show up to the meeting to vote. And so for sure the company has to write the shareholders this proxy vote type of filing. But it sounds like Louis Lerner himself wrote the shareholders himself, something that was very similar in nature to the company's letter. Do you have any memory of?
Well, that's what I said to you before. I just remember something that he put forth. He said, even if you have already voted, this is the one that will be counted.
And so for a shareholder might have been confused in terms of what was going on.
Right.
And I'm pretty sure, and we'll go back to the archives at HBS, but I'm pretty sure I actually saw how the vote came out. And it ended up coming out in favor of Louis Lerner's sort of slate of board of directors, or basically what he wanted. And so at some point, your grandfather sort of separated from the company. Do you have any memory of what that was like?
I was trying to think about that. I really wasn't sure. I thought, I even thought of suggesting, have you ever talked to Chris Hornbostel?
Yeah, so we're going to be potentially meeting him later on this week, and we'll probably do a separate sort of interview with him.
Because
as well.
he might remember more than I did, because I wasn't living up here then.
And do you remember the time period where your grandfather wasn't working at the company, where he was back home?
I do, but
And then he eventually got sick,
became
right?
sick, and that's what I was trying to fit together. I'm not sure. He was sick for a while.
And was he sick while he was? Do you remember if he was sick while he was still working at the national
I
company?
don't
This
think
was after.
so. Excuse me. I tried to think of.
So I think he separated from the company sometime at the end of 1953, early 54. When did he end up dying?
56.
So within 2-3 years of separating from the company. What did you ever talk to your grandfather about the company in those years, or his sort of view about what happened to the company?
Excuse me. I don't recall, because we were mainly more concerned with his health. I've got to get a glass of water.
Yeah, no, we can stop. Katie will grab you some.
Okay, Mike, I'm rolling again.
So we'll just finish up the national company stuff here, and then do some sort of family stuff at the end. So sometime in 53, 54, this Louis Lerner guy takes control of the company. And just looking at the financials, it looks like he sort of juiced up profits for a couple years, and then the company had a really bad year in 1955, and then sort of struggled from that point forward in the late 50s and into the 60s. And looking at some of the history of the company, it basically got sold off to a couple of different companies, and it finally ended up with the name the National Company, and whatever assets were left at that point being sold to some Japanese consumer electronics company. And as far as we know, like, that's sort of where the story ended. Beyond a bunch of amateur radio enthusiasts, again having sort of a cult-like sort of following for the company. But even in reading those people talk about the company, there is a sense of sort of sadness, or what could have been about the company had it not gone in this other direction. What memories do you have of, like, Mimi and Grampy talking about the company, or anybody else sort of afterwards in the succeeding sort of years in the late 50s or 60s. Did you guys ever talk about the national company afterwards?
Well, I wasn't in, up there in those years that much. I was in New York most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
And your grandmother um, was so lived past your grandfather, but she passed away soon before you guys got married, right? Like the right before you got married.
the Wednesday before our wedding,
Hmm.
that was that was quite something. But my mother got us through it. She was so strong. I didn't see how she could pull it off, but she did. So it was because she was strong. We had to be.
Cause you guys had the reception at the house in Weston, right?
Yeah, we did. Well, it was all planned. We had people coming from. We had like 150 people came. We had 6 bridesmaids and 6 ushers. We had the whole deal. And
And who are your bridesmaids? Were they friends from Brookline, friends from Dana Hall?
yes, everything.
So Bubbles.
And Weston Bubs was in it. Annie Bo, Marky Whitney, or Marky Phillips, my friend. And I have to look at a picture.
Was Jackie in it?
Jackie was the maid of honor. And I have to get confused. I have a great picture now. Oh, it's over there. We were all in Jackie and Ed's wedding. The kids were in it. I just found a frame for that the other day.
And then Uncle Bill was he like a ring bearer?
No, Uncle Bill and Chris were the altar boys.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the ceremony, I looked over, and my brother, he looked ashen. I thought, oh God, he's going to throw up or something awful.
And this is at St. Julia's?
It was at St. Julia's with wonderful Father Graff. It was definitely a family wedding.
Yeah. So this is like August 23rd, 1958?
And some people that didn't know my father thought that they thought he was the groom at first, walking
He
me
was a
down.
young looking guy.
They couldn't figure it out. He was always
Because he was only 18 years older than you, right? 18 or 19.
19 years, yeah.
And Mimi must have looked pretty young too.
She did.
And then who did Dad have for groomsmen? Just different, anybody from Kansas?
Yes, Dick Judy
Yeah.
was an usher. We had, I think, they were in Toronto when we lived in Canada. Dick Judy had a job in Canada, and we used to see them. We'd go to Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
We'd see them there. So that's what kept up that friendship.
And where'd you guys live after you got married?
That's when we lived on East 63rd Street.
So New York. And Dad was working for some chemical company or something?
I think so. Yes. He was in the plastics business.
Mm-hmm.
He was selling, and it was, let's see, some kind of, it was a product that was used as the base of the big order they got. It was a small company in Indiana, and he was ripping for them. And they got the base of a dashboard. The underneath part used to be metal, and it was fiberglass reinforced thermoplastics. That's how he got connected with Owens Corning.
And were you still working for Rockefeller after you got married, or?
Yes. Yeah. I did.
And then you guys moved out to Indiana?
No, we moved to New Jersey. We moved over to Hohokus, which is part of Ridgewood.
And then Pat was born in 1960. I thought Pat was born in Indiana.
He was, because they transferred us out to the Indiana to the company.
Yeah.
To work for the company.
In which part of Indiana You were,
Warsaw, right between, halfway between Fort Wayne and South Bend.
yeah. And then Neva came along. Was she born in Warsaw?
Mm-hmm.
And
And then we got, I mean, Warsaw, she was born. Then 13 months later, Neva was born.
yeah,
Have I got that right?
sounds about right. And then, so then John, a couple years later,
Yeah.
was he born in Warsaw, or do you guys live in two different spots in Indiana, or just one?
I have to, this really goes back, they were between taking care of children, having babies, and moving all in the same group of years. Let me see, because somebody was born, I
So-
said we couldn't move till after he was born,
Yeah.
so we moved when he was a month old,
And Kate was born in Indiana too, right?
yes.
So that's, and then you guys moved to, right from there to Toronto, or did you guys live in Pennsylvania at some point?
Yes. She's trying to, I'm not sure. I feel like we did live in Pennsylvania at some point, but I don't think it wasn't in that sequence of events.
Well, then, so Dad got a job up in Canada, and we lived up in Guelph, and then I was born. And then about a year later, we moved back right to Wellesley, to the house in Wellesley.
I think so, because that was the only place we lived, because I knew some of the area. I knew the houses, the sections that Ralph Porter had built.
Mm-hmm.
There were Northgate and Westgate and
Yeah.
something or other.
And so you were closer to your parents again,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably a big support for you.
We were,
When did Mimi start the chestnut shop?
let's see, 56. I think it was 1956.
And when did the big house get sold? Like, when did Mimi and Grampy build their house right next door?
Let's see. Or it was after my grandmother. They stayed there at the big house for about a year, because that's when, and then they sold it, and then they built, Mimi and Grampy built their house on a couple of acres of the land.
Yeah. And at this point, Charlie and Lena had moved to New York, or because he wasn't working for the national company anymore at
I
some
know
point.
I was thinking, yeah, they moved, he took a job in New York when he did, and that's when they moved to Darien, Connecticut.
Yeah.
But all during the war, when I said it was Washington, but then I think at one point they lived in West Newton. I don't know whether that was after Charlie came back from Washington. I have to look at the calendar and dope it out.
So the last thing, we were just going to walk around and take a look at some of these pictures, and then if you had sort of any sort of comments about the pictures or memories from the pictures, we'll record that, and that's pretty much it.
Okay. Some of those pictures I can see it a little better, but
Rolling here.
well, that doesn't necessarily have to be perfect.
Okay, Mike, I'm rolling.
So this one was built and tested on October 25th, 1945. So basically at the end of the war.
Yeah.
And so this was probably a newer version that maybe allowed easier access to
You can decide.
to the components. And again, what set the national HRO radios apart was their ability to tune very quickly and accurately into a particular frequency that a German submarine or military unit was using. And they had these 4 sets of tuners, and then there's coils, particular customized coils down below, and they could change out this coil set for different purposes.
Oh, I see, that's why they pull it out.
Yeah. And the operator could mark see there's markings there. They could mark particular frequencies or settings for the radio to again dial in very quickly to a particular
I see.
frequency. So yeah, so this would have been state of the art at the end of World War II. And again, this is from a museum in Windsor, Connecticut, a wireless museum that happens to be in the same town that we live in.
Isn't that something?
So that's your grandfather, right?
Yeah.
And it looks like there was some sort of bowling thing. This must be a Weston Golf Club, right?
It could have been.
Did he bowl?
I'm not sure. Well, it could have been. I forgot the bowling alley's there.
And so was this at Weston Golf Club too? Or do you have any sense of where that is? So it looks like you're sort of in your teenage years. And that's your grandfather right there, right?
Yeah.
And so who else is
And
Mimi?
Yes, that's my grandmother there, and mother's there. See the big 5 it?
Yeah. Was Grampy there too?
I don't. He might have been, but I don't remember. This is a.
Is this a social gathering or is it national company people?
It's. Yes, no, this man's name is Bill Matson. I know these were his class, people in his class, I think, at MIT.
Oh, okay.
I recognize some of the faces here, but the rest of the family wouldn't have been there unless, because Mother and I were usually the ones that got invited to whatever they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's about as much as I can tell you about that picture.
Yeah. So this one's from the radio industry meeting, Army Navy, WPB dinner, Bellevue Stratford Hotel. I'm guessing, is that New York? I'm sort of guessing. In October 8th, 1942, and on the back it's written Pops and Admiral Dan Shea.
I just remember that
And
name.
I think they're sitting back here because they're sort of writing next to people's names.
Oh my gosh.
So there's one that's identified as Admiral Dan Shea.
I remember him coming to the house, but I can't remember. I wouldn't recognize him. I don't think did. Yeah, that was the War Production Board, that WPB.
So this one is the National Company Inc. Army Navy E-Banquet, Malden, Mass., September 14th, 1943. And this thing on the back, something together for victory. So it was like a victory party. And there's got to be, I don't know, a couple thousand people there.
Goodness.
And I think your grandfather and some are up on this main table. But it's like the local policeman.
Is this the same picture that was on the television?
No, it might have been different.
Because I did find him at a head table. What'd you say it was? What year?
1943, September.
Oh, okay.
So again, there's got to be, we could probably count it up, there's got to be 2,000 or 3,000 people.
Good heavens.
And this is in Malden somewhere.
I just wondered what it was that brought that many people. Oh. He was right maybe underneath that thing. I was thinking maybe he's sitting somewhere up there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I can't tell with so many people. I don't see any faces I recognize in there. But with that many people, they could have come from everywhere.
So we've got a couple of shots from ships. There's one I've got in my office that's from the USS Wasp, who Susan's father apparently served on as an officer. So this looks like it's a bunch of civilians and then some of the officers of the ship, and I'm sure they're probably doing some testing of the wireless radios. So again, we've talked about there's at least 2 or 3 different histories of the company. This is one that's pretty prominent by John Nagel, and I'm pretty sure this was published in the first edition of, I think it's QST magazine, which is like the wireless magazine.
Is that it? I remember something about QSC.
Check, check. 1, 2. Check, check. 1, 2. Check. Check, check. Check, check. 1, 2. Check, check.
Editions, this person, John Nagel, and again, he in his writing says, sort of acknowledges James Millen quite a bit. So this is sort of a James Millen heavy history of the National Company. But it does talk about his dispute with Hopkins over the strategic direction of the company. With Hopkins, and so my question, looking at this picture, is who are all these graduates, the class of 1913, and what did they all do during the war?
Oh, that might be
Did they
right.
do research on behalf of the war? You know, maybe somebody helped work on the atomic bomb. You know, these are all sort of the best and brightest from the class of 1913. And this is a cool picture, 2 years before the war. And you could imagine, you know, what did some of these guys do during the war?
Oh, yeah, I don't know that I could help you on that.
Yeah, so, but I should be able to get a list of the graduates of the class of 1913. That shouldn't be too hard. And then, you know, through the magic of the internet, you can pretty quickly do some research.
That lady looks familiar. I knew more people over in that other, is that the class 2 over
Yep.
there? Oh, I remember that big lady. She was sitting right behind me, wasn't she? I don't know what her name was.
This last picture, I wish we could date, because my sense is, it was unusual to see so many women, but if it was during World War II, it wouldn't be unusual at all. In terms
They did
of,
have women who were
in terms of men being drafted or volunteering and
That's
not being
right.
there. So I wish I could
well, they
date
were
that
good
one.
and they were more nimble-fingered.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of women over there. But these are amazing pictures.
And there's a couple of shots. A bunch of the earlier shots in the book are sort of technical shots of radios and components.
Mm-hmm.
But these ones in the back are pretty neat in terms of what it looked like to actually work there. It almost looks like it's early war or pre-war.
A lot to do. Well, and people were glad to have a way to earn a living.
Yeah, so the technical design of
Mhm.
the actual dial. And it's a pretty, that dial is sort of a